The radio crackled with static as Captain Delilah Redbird Vasquez banked her, Thunderbolt II through the crystalline Afghan sky. Below, the Helmand province stretched like cracked leather, its valleys hiding secrets that had swallowed entire battalions. She'd been flying combat missions for 8 years, but today felt different. The intelligence briefing had been vague, too vague. A routine close air support mission for a SEAL team conducting reconnaissance near the Pakistani border. Routine. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Redbird, this is Viper Actual, the voice of Navy SEAL Lieutenant Commander Marcus Viper Sullivan cut through her headset. His tone carried that familiar edge of skepticism she'd heard from ground forces before. Another Air Force pilot. Another pretty face behind the stick. She'd proven herself 100 times over, but the doubt always lingered in their voices like smoke from a dying fire. Copy, Viper Actual. Redbird on station, 30 minutes of playtime remaining. Her voice was steady, professional. Years of dealing with condescension had taught her to let her flying speak louder than her words. The terrain below was a patchwork of ancient irrigation canals and mud brick compounds, each one a potential fortress. Intel suggested Taliban forces had been massing in this sector, but satellite imagery showed nothing unusual. That's what worried her. In Afghanistan, nothing was ever as it seemed. Redbird, we're moving to Checkpoint Alpha. Maintain high cover and try to keep up. The patronizing undertone in Viper's transmission made her jaw tighten. She'd graduated top of her class from the Air Force Academy, survived the grueling A-10 training program where 70% washed out, and had more confirmed kills than most pilots accumulated in 2 tours. But she was still the girl who had to prove herself every single day. The A-10's twin General Electric TF-34 engines hummed beneath her, the familiar vibration traveling through the aircraft's titanium bathtub that surrounded her cockpit. This machine had been built for one purpose: to rain hellfire on enemy positions and bring her people home alive. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon in her nose carried 1,174 rounds of 30 ammunition, each one capable of punching through tank armor. But today, something in her gut told her that conventional firepower might not be enough. Through her targeting pod's infrared display, she watched Viper's 8-man team moving in perfect formation across the valley floor. They moved like shadows, disciplined and lethal, but they had no idea what was waiting for them in those ancient hills, and neither did she. The sky above Afghanistan had witnessed countless stories of courage and sacrifice. Today, it would witness the birth of a legend that would be whispered in ready rooms and barracks for decades to come. But first, it would test everything Delilah Vasquez believed about herself and everything her country believed about her. 27-year-old Captain Vasquez had earned her call sign, Redbird, during her first deployment, when she'd painted a small red cardinal on her helmet after her grandmother's funeral. The old woman had always said cardinals were messengers from heaven, watching over those they loved. Now, 15,000 feet above enemy territory, Delilah wondered who was watching over Viper team and whether she would be enough to bring them home. The radio silence stretched on, broken only by the whisper of wind across her canopy and the steady rhythm of her breathing. In the distance, the Hindu Kush mountains pierced the horizon like broken teeth, and somewhere in those shadows, death was preparing to spring its trap. The intelligence failure had been catastrophic, though none of them knew it yet. What was supposed to be a small Taliban cell turned out to be a carefully orchestrated deception. For 3 weeks, enemy forces had been moving through underground tunnels, positioning themselves for the perfect ambush. They knew the Americans were coming. They'd been waiting. Captain Vasquez performed another lazy orbit, her eyes constantly scanning the landscape below. The A-10 responded to her touch like a familiar lover, every control input translated into precise movement. This aircraft had been designed in the 1970s to destroy Soviet tanks rolling across European plains, but it had found its true calling in the asymmetric warfare of the Middle East. Low, slow, and deadly, just the way she liked it. Viper Actual, Redbird. I'm seeing some unusual heat signatures about 2 clicks northeast of your position. Multiple vehicles under what looks like camouflage netting. Her trained eye had caught something the satellites had missed. Years of studying enemy tactics had taught her to recognize the subtle signs of a prepared ambush. Negative, Redbird. Intelligence says that area is clear, probably just local farmers. The dismissal in Sullivan's voice was unmistakable. Ground forces always thought they knew better than the pilots circling overhead. But Delilah had learned to trust her instincts, especially when everyone else doubted them. She banked left, bringing her targeting pod to bear on the suspicious area. Through the thermal imaging, she could see the unmistakable geometric patterns of military vehicles arranged in fighting positions. This wasn't a farming operation. This was a kill zone, and Viper Team was walking straight into it. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like armor. 8 Navy SEALs were depending on her to keep them alive, whether they believed in her capabilities or not. In 15 minutes, their skepticism would transform into desperate gratitude. But first, she had to convince them to listen to a pilot they'd already dismissed. The Afghan sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the landscape below, and Captain Delilah Redbird Vasquez prepared to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes come from the most unexpected places. The first indication of trouble came not from radar or radio, but from a feeling, that electric sensation every combat pilot learns to recognize. The hair on the back of Delilah's neck stood up as she noticed birds erupting from hidden positions across the valley floor. Wildlife had a way of sensing danger before humans did, and right now, every living creature below was fleeing. Viper Actual, Redbird. You need to halt your advance immediately. I'm seeing significant movement in multiple positions around your route. Her voice carried more urgency now, but she kept it professional. Panic was contagious over the radio, and the last thing ground troops needed was a pilot who sounded scared. Redbird, maintain your orbit and stay off the net unless you have confirmed enemy contact. We know how to do our job down here. Sullivan's response was sharp, dismissive. The unspoken message was clear. Stay in your lane, flyby. Through her multifunction display, Delilah watched the infrared signatures of Viper Team moving steadily forward. They were exceptional operators, but they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. The enemy had been watching American tactics for 20 years, learning their patterns, adapting their strategies. They knew exactly how Navy SEALs moved, and they'd positioned themselves accordingly. The A-10's targeting systems painted a digital picture of the battlefield that told a story ground forces couldn't see. Heat signatures clustered in defensive positions, the subtle glint of metal reflecting sunlight, the geometric patterns of deliberate military positioning. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to spring. "Come on, Marcus," she whispered to herself, using Sullivan's first name though they'd never met face to face. "Trust me just this once." Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Mija, sometimes God puts you in a place where only you can see what needs to be seen. When that happens, you speak up, even if nobody wants to listen." The old woman had been talking about standing up to bullies in school, but the principle remained the same. Delilah adjusted her altitude slightly, bringing her sensors to bear on a compound that had been bothering her since she'd arrived on station. The thermal imagery revealed something that made her blood run cold, at least 40 heat signatures moving in coordinated patterns inside the walls. This wasn't a small Taliban cell. This was a company-sized element, maybe larger. The radio crackled with routine updates from Viper Team as they approached the kill zone. Their discipline was impressive, short, coded transmissions that revealed their position without giving away operational details. But discipline wouldn't save them from what was waiting in those hills. Viper Actual, Redbird declaring troops in contact in 30 seconds. You are walking into a prepared ambush with at least 40 enemy fighters. Recommend immediate extraction to Rally Point Bravo. She'd used the formal declaration, the magic words that would light up every radio in the operational chain of command. The silence that followed stretched for an eternity. Then Sullivan's voice came back, harder than before. "Redbird, you are out of line. We see no enemy activity. Maintain your orbit and stop interfering with ground operations." That's when the first mortar round exploded 50 meters from Viper Team's position, and everything changed. The explosion bloomed like a deadly flower in her thermal display, the shockwave rippling outward in concentric circles. Before the sound reached her cockpit 15,000 feet above, 3 more mortars impacted around the SEAL team's position. The carefully orchestrated ambush had begun, and 8 of America's elite warriors were caught in the open with nowhere to run. "Contact! Contact! We are taking effective mortar fire from multiple positions." Sullivan's voice had lost its condescending edge, replaced by the clipped professionalism of a man fighting for his life. "Redbird, we need immediate close air support on the compound to our northeast." Delilah was already rolling her A-10 into an attack run before he finished speaking. The familiar weight of G-forces pressed her into her ejection seat as she dove toward the Earth, her targeting systems automatically calculating firing solutions. The compound Sullivan had identified was exactly where she'd spotted the suspicious heat signatures minutes earlier. "Viper actual, Redbird inbound hot, danger close, marking target with smoke." Her thumb found the trigger for her LAU-131 rocket pod, sending a white phosphorus marker streaking toward the compound. The smoke would give the SEALs a reference point and obscure the enemy's vision. As she pulled through the bottom of her attack dive, the GAU-8 cannon came alive with a sound like the world's largest chainsaw. The 30 depleted uranium rounds stitched across the compound walls at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute, each impact sending up fountains of dust and debris. The cannon's recoil was so powerful it actually slowed the aircraft, a sensation that never got old. "Good hits, good hits. Keep it coming, Redbird." The respect in Sullivan's voice was unmistakable now. When death was reaching for you with mortar shells and machine gun fire, the person keeping it at bay became the most important human being in your universe. But this was only the beginning. As Delilah climbed back to altitude, her radar warning receiver began chirping insistently. Someone down there had just painted her aircraft with targeting radar, which meant the Taliban had brought surface-to-air missiles to this party. The hunters were about to become the hunted. "Redbird, be advised we're tracking multiple SAM sites coming online around your position." The voice of the airborne warning and control system aircraft crackled through her headset. "Recommend you egress to the north and climb to Angels 25. But egressing meant leaving Viper Team to die in that valley, and that wasn't going to happen. Not on her watch. The surface-to-air missile launch looked like a streak of lightning reaching up from the Earth, its exhaust trail perfectly straight until the seeker head acquired her aircraft's heat signature. Then the trail began to curve, following her A-10's thermal footprint like a bloodhound following a scent. The missile was an SA-16, shoulder-fired, with just enough range and speed to ruin her entire day. Missile launch. Redbird defending south. Delilah threw her aircraft into a defensive turn, diving toward the deck while dispensing flares from her countermeasures pod. The magnesium flares burned hotter than her engines, creating false targets designed to seduce the missile's infrared seeker away from her aircraft. The SA-16 took the bait, detonating harmlessly among the flares 200 meters behind her tail. But there would be more missiles, and eventually her luck would run out. She had to end this fight quickly, before the enemy's superior numbers overwhelmed her ability to defend both herself and the men on the ground. "Viper actual, I need you to laser designate the primary threat. Light up the biggest gun you can see, and I'll put a Maverick right down its throat." The AGM-65D Maverick missile hanging from her wing pylon carried a 125-pound warhead that could punch through 3 feet of reinforced concrete. One well-placed shot could turn the tide of this battle. "Copy, Redbird. Lasing target now." Sullivan's voice was steady despite the chaos erupting around his team. The SEAL's laser designator painted an invisible infrared beam on a heavy machine gun position that was pouring fire into their defensive perimeter. Delilah's targeting display showed a perfect lock, the crosshairs centered on the enemy position. She squeezed the trigger, feeling the slight jolt as the Maverick separated from its pylon. The missile streaked downward, following the laser's guidance with mechanical precision, before exploding in a fireball that silenced the machine gun forever. But for every position they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The Taliban had been planning this ambush for weeks, positioning fighters in spider holes and reverse slope positions that were nearly invisible from the air. They were using the terrain like a weapon, forcing Delilah to expose herself to ground fire every time she made an attack run. "Redbird, Viper 6 is hit. We need immediate dust-off." The pain in Sullivan's voice cut through the tactical chatter like a blade. One of his men was down, bleeding out in the Afghan dirt while enemy fire continued to rain down around them. The medevac helicopter was 20 minutes out, 20 minutes these men didn't have. Unless she could buy them time, could thin out the enemy forces enough to give the SEALs breathing room, this mission would end with 8 flag-draped coffins and another set of Gold Star families. Delilah armed her remaining ordnance and began the deadliest game of her military career. The second missile came from a different position, launched just as she rolled wings level after her latest gun run. This time there was no warning from her radar warning receiver. The SA-16 was a fire-and-forget weapon that didn't need continuous radar guidance. She saw the launch visually, a bright streak climbing toward her through the afternoon haze. Her reaction was instinctive, born from hundreds of hours of training and the muscle memory of survival. She rolled inverted and pulled the stick back, diving toward the earth while simultaneously deploying chaff and flares. The A-10 wasn't built for aerobatics, but it was tough enough to handle the abuse she was putting it through. The missile passed close enough to her cockpit that she could see the Cyrillic markings on its side. The explosion when it detonated felt like being kicked by a giant, rattling her teeth and filling her headset with static. But she was still flying, still breathing, still fighting. "Redbird, that was too close. We can't afford to lose you up there." Sullivan's voice carried genuine concern now. The skepticism had been burned away in the crucible of combat, replaced by the desperate hope of men who knew their survival depended on the woman in the cockpit above them. Below, she could see Viper Team's defensive perimeter shrinking as enemy fighters pressed closer. Muzzle flashes sparked from dozens of positions, creating a constellation of death centered on the small group of Americans. The SEALs were running low on ammunition, and their casualty was slowing them down. That's when Delilah made a decision that would define the rest of her career, and possibly end it. "Viper Actual, I'm going to make a low pass and suppress the enemy positions on your eastern flank. When I do, you move your wounded man to that cluster of rocks about 50 meters north of your position. I'll cover your movement." "Negative, Redbird, that's suicide. The ground fire is too heavy." But she was already rolling into her attack dive, dropping lower than she'd ever gone in combat. The A-10 screamed toward the earth at 300 knots, her cannon spitting death at every muzzle flash she could identify. Tracer rounds reached up toward her like deadly fireworks, some passing so close to her canopy she could see the individual bullets. At 100 feet above the ground, flying through a storm of enemy fire, Captain Delilah Vasquez proved that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite fear, when the lives of your brothers and sisters depend on it. The ultra-low attack run was like flying through hell itself. Delilah could hear individual bullets striking her aircraft, the sharp ping of metal on metal mixing with the roar of her engines and the thunderous bark of her cannon. Her windscreen spiderwebbed from a near miss, but the A-10's legendary durability kept her airborne. She pulled up from the gun run with her heart hammering against her ribs, climbing back to a safer altitude while her aircraft groaned in protest. Warning lights flickered across her instrument panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical systems fluctuating, fuel leak detected. But she was still flying, and below, Viper team was moving. Beautiful work, Redbird. We're in position and the eastern flank is neutralized. Sullivan's voice carried something she'd never heard from a ground force commander before, pure admiration. The SEAL who doubted her capabilities was now watching her save his men's lives with a combination of skill and courage he'd rarely witnessed. But the battle was far from over. As she climbed back to altitude, her damaged aircraft struggling to maintain airspeed, new threats were emerging across the valley. Her thermal sensors showed vehicles moving toward the fight, technicals mounted with heavy machine guns and recoilless rifles, racing to reinforce the ambush. Multiple vehicles approaching from the southwest, looks like at least 6 technicals with heavy weapons. ETA to your position approximately 5 minutes, she reported, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her. The math was simple and brutal. 6 vehicles with crews meant at least 30 more fighters joining the battle, armed with weapons capable of overwhelming Viper team's defensive position. The SEALs had already expended most of their ammunition, their wounded team member was deteriorating, and the medevac helicopter was still 15 minutes away. That's when Lieutenant Commander Sullivan made a decision that would echo through special operations communities for years to come. His voice crackled through the radio, clear and certain. Redbird, I'm giving you tactical control of this engagement. You can see what we can't see. Tell us how to stay alive. The trust in those words hit her like a physical force. A Navy SEAL, one of the most elite warriors in the American military, was handing over tactical command to the Air Force pilot he dismissed just 30 minutes earlier. It was unprecedented, revolutionary, and absolutely necessary. Copy, Viper Actual. First priority is relocating your position before those vehicles arrive. I need you to move northwest to that wadi about 200 meters from your current location. It'll give you better cover and cleaner fields of fire. As the SEALs began their tactical movement, Delilah turned her attention to the approaching convoy. Her remaining Maverick missile was locked and loaded, but she needed to make it count. The lead vehicle was a Toyota Hilux with a Soviet-era 14.5 heavy machine gun mounted in the bed, enough firepower to shred the SEAL's defensive position in seconds. The missile streaked downward like a falling star, its warhead detonating against the Technical's engine block. The explosion flipped the vehicle end over end, scattering burning debris across the narrow mountain road. But the other vehicles kept coming, their crews now alerted to the threat from above. What happened next would become legend in aviation circles. A damaged A-10 Thunderbolt II, flown by a pilot everyone had underestimated, taking on an entire Taliban company with nothing but cannon fire and sheer determination. The gun runs that followed were a masterclass in close air support, each pass precisely calculated to maximize damage while minimizing risk to the friendly forces below. Delilah's aircraft absorbed punishment that would have downed lesser planes, but the A-10 had been built around its pilot, designed to bring her home even with massive battle damage. As she rolled in for her 6th attack run, hydraulic fluid streaming from bullet holes in her aircraft's belly, the radio crackled with an unexpected voice. Redbird, this is Dustoff 7-1. We are 2 minutes out from your position. Where do you want us? The medevac helicopter had arrived early, its crew pushing their aircraft to maximum speed after hearing the desperate radio calls. But landing in a hot zone was suicide unless someone could clear the landing area of enemy fighters. Dustoff 7-1, give me 30 seconds to prep your LZ. Delilah armed her last ordnance, a cluster bomb unit that would scatter submunitions across a wide area, perfect for clearing enemy infantry from an open space. She rolled inverted and dove toward the small clearing where the helicopter needed to land, her finger poised over the weapon release button. At the last possible second, she pickled off the CBU, pulling up so hard that her vision grayed around the edges from the G-forces. The cluster bomb airburst exactly as designed, scattering smaller bomblets across the landing zone like deadly confetti. Enemy fighters who had been moving to intercept the helicopter were caught in the open, neutralized by the precision munitions. LZ is clear. Dustoff 7-1 cleared hot to land. Her voice was hoarse from breathing the thin air at altitude, but it carried the authority of someone who had just orchestrated one of the most successful close air support missions in modern warfare. As the US-60 Black Hawk touched down in the cleared landing zone, Viper team rushed their wounded teammate toward the aircraft. The SEAL who'd been hit was conscious, giving a weak thumbs up to the pilot circling overhead, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. But the mission wasn't over yet. As the medevac helicopter lifted off with its precious cargo, new threats were emerging from the surrounding hills. The Taliban had committed everything to this ambush, and they weren't finished fighting. "Redbird, we've got movement on all sides now. Looks like they're trying to surround us." Sullivan's voice was grim but determined. The SEALs had fought their way to a more defensible position, but they were still outnumbered and low on ammunition. That's when the radio crackled with the most beautiful sound Delilah had ever heard. "Redbird, this is Hammer Flight, flight of 4 F-16s, 5 minutes out with a full load of party favors. What do you need?" Reinforcements had arrived, drawn by the emergency frequencies and the desperate nature of the fight. But coordinating 4 fast-moving fighters with troops in close contact required someone with intimate knowledge of the tactical situation, someone who'd been orchestrating this dance of death for the past 40 minutes. "Hammer Flight, this is Redbird. I have tactical control of this engagement. Stand by for target assignments." Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had just proved herself in the most demanding arena possible, actual combat. As she began directing the incoming F-16s to their targets, Captain Delilah "Redbird" Vasquez realized that everything had changed. The pilot everyone had doubted had just saved the lives of 8 Navy SEALs and orchestrated one of the most complex close air support missions in recent memory. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something much more valuable: respect earned through competence and courage under fire. But the real test was still to come. The coordination of multiple aircraft in close proximity to friendly forces was like conducting a lethal orchestra, each instrument precisely timed to create a symphony of destruction. Delilah's voice remained calm and professional as she directed the incoming F-16s, despite her own aircraft trailing smoke and struggling to maintain altitude. "Hammer 1-1, take the compound at grid November Victor 674921. Multiple fighters in hardened positions. Recommend GBU-12 for precision penetration." "Copy, Redbird. Hammer 1-1 inbound hot, laser-guided 500-pounder." The F-16 pilot's response carried the crisp professionalism of someone who understood the stakes. Below, American lives hung in the balance. The laser-guided bomb struck the compound's main building with surgical precision, the explosion contained within the structure's walls. Secondary explosions followed as enemy ammunition stores detonated, sending pillars of smoke into the afternoon sky. "Excellent hit, Hammer 1-1. Hammer 1-2, I need you to work over the ridgeline to the east, troops in spider holes with RPGs." Each target assignment was based on her intimate knowledge of the battlefield, gained through nearly an hour of continuous observation and engagement. As the F-16s began their systematic destruction of enemy positions, Delilah's damaged A-10 continued its lonely orbit above the battlefield. Her aircraft was bleeding fuel from multiple punctures, her hydraulic pressure was almost zero, and her electrical systems were operating on backup power. By all rights, she should have been heading home to the nearest friendly airfield. But home was where her people were safe, and Viper Team was still in contact with enemy forces. Redbird, this is Viper Actual. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done up there. You saved our lives. Sullivan's voice carried an emotion she'd rarely heard from special operations personnel, genuine gratitude mixed with profound respect. Just doing my job, Viper Actual. Let's get you boys home safe. Her response was characteristic of her personality, humble, professional, focused on the mission rather than personal recognition. As the F-16s continued their precision strikes, the enemy fire directed at Viper Team's position began to slacken. The Taliban fighters were either dead, wounded, or fleeing the systematic destruction being rained down from above. The ambush that was supposed to eliminate an American Special Operations team had instead become a devastating defeat for the enemy. All stations, this is Overlord 6. The voice of the Joint Terminal Attack Controller at the Tactical Operations Center cut through the tactical frequency. Be advised, intelligence indicates this was a high-value target elimination attempt. Enemy forces specifically positioned to target American Special Operations teams. Excellent work all around. The implications of that intelligence assessment wouldn't sink in until later. The Taliban had been planning this operation for weeks, possibly months. They'd studied American tactics, prepared multiple fallback positions, and committed significant resources to killing 8 Navy SEALs. Instead, they'd lost nearly 100 fighters and learned a painful lesson about underestimating American air power and the pilots who wielded it. Viper Actual, extraction birds are inbound. ETA 15 minutes to your position. The voice belonged to the Combat Search and Rescue Coordinator, orchestrating the complex dance of getting the SEALs out of enemy territory. As the battlefield quieted, save for the distant rumble of jet engines and the crackle of burning vehicles, Delilah allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. Her fuel gauges showed less than 15 minutes of flying time remaining. Her aircraft was held together by determination and engineering excellence, and she just coordinated the most complex air-ground engagement of her career. The radio silence that followed was filled with the sound of her labored breathing and the whisper of wind through the bullet holes in her canopy. Somewhere below, 8 American warriors were preparing to go home to their families because she'd refused to accept their skepticism and had trusted her training instead. The extraction went smoothly, with Viper Team loading aboard a pair of MH-60 helicopters, while F-16s provided top cover. As the Special Operations birds lifted off and headed east toward friendly territory, Delilah finally turned her battered aircraft toward home. The flight back to Bagram Airfield was a testament to the A-10's legendary durability and her own skill as a pilot. With multiple systems damaged or destroyed, she nursed the aircraft through the mountain passes, constantly adjusting for the handling changes caused by battle damage. Every control input had to be recalculated, every turn planned in advance. As she approached the airfield, the tower controller's voice crackled through her headset. "Redbird, be advised you have priority handling and emergency equipment standing by. How do you feel about your aircraft?" Looking at her instrument panel, more warning lights than green indicators, she keyed her microphone. "Tower, I think she'll make it home, but it's going to be interesting." The landing was controlled crash more than a normal approach, her damaged flight controls requiring constant attention to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway. As the main landing gear touched down, she could feel the A-10 pulling to the left, damaged hydraulics making the aircraft difficult to control on the ground. But she was home, and more importantly, so were 8 Navy SEALs who'd started the day as skeptics and ended it as believers. As Delilah shut down her engines and began the post-flight procedures, She noticed something that made her smile despite the exhaustion and adrenaline crash beginning to set in. Painted on the side of her cockpit, just below the canopy rail, were 8 small red marks, her personal tally of lives saved during today's mission. The ground crew that swarmed her aircraft was unusually quiet as they assessed the battle damage. Bullet holes stitched across the fuselage, hydraulic lines severed, electrical components destroyed. By all rights, the aircraft should have gone down over enemy territory. But the A-10 had been built for exactly this kind of punishment, and she'd brought it home intact. As she climbed down from the cockpit, her legs shaky from the adrenaline come-down, Delilah was surprised to see a familiar figure waiting for her on the tarmac. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan stood beside a maintenance truck, his tactical gear still dusty from the firefight, his face bearing the 1,000-yard stare that followed intense combat. The Navy SEAL who'd questioned her competence just hours earlier walked toward her with measured steps. When he stopped in front of her, he did something that would be talked about in ready rooms across the theater of operations for years to come. He unslung his HK-416 rifle and handed it to her, stock first, the military equivalent of a sword being offered by a conquered knight to a victorious enemy. Except they weren't enemies anymore. They were something much more valuable. They were warriors who had earned each other's respect through shared danger and mutual trust. "This belonged to the man you saved today," Sullivan said, his voice thick with emotion. "He wanted you to have it, said any pilot crazy enough to fly through that much ground fire deserved to carry a SEAL's weapon." The rifle was more than a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of acceptance into one of the most exclusive fraternities in the American military. Special operations personnel didn't give their weapons to just anyone. They gave them to people who had proven themselves worthy of carrying the burden of protecting others. As Delilah accepted the rifle, she noticed the inscription etched into the stock, "For those who serve so others may sleep peacefully." It was a motto that applied to SEALs and pilots alike, a reminder of why they accepted the risks inherent in their profession. The crowd that had gathered around the damaged A-10 began to applaud. Maintenance crews, other pilots, support personnel who'd monitored the battle from the operations center. The sound built slowly, then crescendoed into something approaching a roar of approval. But the real recognition would come later, in the official reports and award citations that would follow. What mattered now was that 8 men were alive who might otherwise have been dead, and the pilot everyone had doubted had proven that courage and competence were more important than gender or preconceptions. As the sun set over Bagram Airfield, painting the Hindu Kush Mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Captain Delilah, Redbird, Vasquez walked toward the debriefing room carrying a Navy SEAL's rifle and the knowledge that she'd just written her name into the history books of American military aviation. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself all over again. But tonight, she was simply a warrior who had done her job exceptionally well, earning the respect of her peers through the only currency that mattered in their profession: competence under fire. The debriefing room buzzed with quiet energy as intelligence officers, operations personnel, and senior leaders gathered to hear the details of what would officially become known as the Helmand Valley engagement. Delilah sat at the polished conference table, still wearing her flight suit, the borrowed SEAL rifle leaning against her chair like a silent testimony to the day's events. Colonel James Hammer Morrison, the wing commander, studied the preliminary battle damage assessment with the expression of someone trying to process something unprecedented. 27 bullet holes in the aircraft, 3 major systems damaged, fuel system compromised. And yet the pilot had continued fighting for over an hour while coordinating multiple aircraft and saving 8 lives. "Captain Vasquez," Morrison began, his voice carrying the gravitas of 3 decades in military aviation, "what you accomplished today goes beyond exceptional airmanship. You turned what could have been a catastrophic loss into a decisive victory against a numerically superior enemy force. The intelligence officer, a thin major with wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward with his tablet displaying digital maps and enemy disposition charts. Our post-strike reconnaissance indicates you engaged and neutralized approximately 80 enemy fighters, destroyed 6 vehicles, and eliminated 3 major weapons positions. The Taliban committed their entire regional reserve to this operation. Sullivan, who'd been invited to participate in the debriefing, spoke up from his position near the wall. "Sir, with respect, those numbers don't tell the whole story. Captain Vasquez didn't just engage targets. She orchestrated a complex battle while taking fire, coordinated multiple aircraft, and made tactical decisions that kept my team alive when we were completely outgunned." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Close air support was supposed to be a supporting role, with ground forces maintaining tactical control of engagements. What had happened in the Helmand Valley represented a fundamental shift. An Air Force pilot had assumed tactical command of a joint operation and executed it flawlessly under the most demanding circumstances possible. "Captain, walk us through your decision-making process," Morrison requested. "Help us understand how you managed such a complex engagement while dealing with battle damage to your own aircraft." Delilah straightened in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, it came down to situational awareness and trust. I could see the entire battlefield from my position, while the ground team's view was necessarily limited. When Lieutenant Commander Sullivan gave me tactical control, it allowed us to coordinate fires and movement more effectively than traditional procedures would have permitted." What she didn't say, what military protocol and modesty,